Carol Anderson is a professor of African American Studies at Emory University and the author of the award-winning book White Rage. Her new book is One Person, No Vote: How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy, and it brings her back to the show. Welcome back, Professor Anderson.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Brian.
You opened the book by talking about the results in 2016 when African Americans showed up at the polls in lower numbers than in previous elections. And you make the case that that was as much about deliberate efforts to suppress their votes as because of what the media has talked about a lot more, which is a lack of enthusiasm for Hillary Clinton compared to Barack Obama. So was the lower turnout primarily in states with impediments to voting?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can, in fact, see that in states that had enacted voter suppression laws, those are the states that flipped from blue to Trump. And those voter suppression laws were very targeted hits. And
so if we think of those votes, those states generally as in the South, Texas, North Carolina, are they also Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania?
Yes, they absolutely are. And that is because the drive for this latest wave of voter suppression have been the Republicans. And so where you are seeing Republican governments where the legislature and the governor are both Republicans, that's where you're seeing the implementation of a lot of these horrific laws.
You review in the book the history of anti-black voter suppression that dates from Reconstruction, things like poll taxes and literacy tests that people know if they know history, and how the 1965 Voting Rights Act finally resulted in an end to many of those things. And yet something has changed back after the Supreme Court decision that many see as eviscerating that law. Remind us of that.
Yeah, and that evisceration was the Shelby County v. Holder decision in 2013 by the U.S. Supreme Court, where in a 5-4 decision written by Chief Justice John Roberts, he argued that the Voting Rights Act was no longer necessary because of the rampant racism that had required the Voting Rights Act in the first place was no longer active in the United States. He said that the law was basically calcified because so few districts had been bailed out of the pre-clearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act.
And so one thing that's changed is that since a Democratic president, LBJ, pushed through the Voting Rights Act, the Republicans, rather than the Southern Democrats, became the party resisting expansion of voting access.
Absolutely, because what you had with the Southern strategy is you had those Southern Democrats being wooed into the party, particularly in 1968 and solidified in 1980, first by Nixon and then by Reagan. And so it just took that kind of virulent white supremacy that operated in policy-wise in the Democratic Party and moved it into the Republican Party.
President Trump was elected without winning the popular vote, the second time that has happened in recent history. Of course, George W. Bush won that way in 2000, once Florida's electoral votes were given to him. You see a through line between the two results, but not just what happened in Florida, also in Missouri, and particularly voting in St. Louis, and especially the now what we think of as Trumpian idea that widespread voter fraud needed to be addressed. Give us some of that backstory.
Yeah, so some of that backstory with St. Louis is that the St. Louis Board of Elections had illegally purged almost 50,000 voters who were primarily in Democratic precincts, purged them from the voter rolls, and didn't inform them. So this is a clearly illegal purge. People came to the voting precinct to vote, found out they weren't on the rolls, but the poll workers didn't have any way to verify it. They couldn't call in because the lines were jammed. People were sent downtown to the Board of Elections, left there for hours trying to figure it out. The polls are getting ready to close. Democrats get a court order to keep the polls open for 3 additional hours to deal with this backlog. Republicans came back and immediately had a court shut down the polls within 45 minutes, hollering that this was about massive voter fraud.
And in case anyone is in doubt that the goal of greater voter access is universal, here's an old clip from 1980 of conservative activist Paul Weyrich, co-founder of the Heritage Foundation, Moral Majority, and other groups, in a speech that we think is before a Christian right audience in Dallas, but he speaks very candidly to this group in 1980.
Now, many of our Christians have what I call the goo-goo syndrome. Good government. They want everybody to vote. I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. They never have been from the beginning of our country, and they are not now. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections, quite candidly, goes up as the voting populace goes down.
Gasp.
Yes.
That was candid.
That was candid, and that's the blueprint. That's the blueprint.
Let's take a call of pushback, I think, from Leonardo and Yapank. Hello, Leonardo. You're on WNYC.
Hey, can you hear me?
Sure can.
Okay. My background is kind of diverse, but part of it includes many years working for the Board of Elections. And I have to tell you that I have a big problem believing that anyone is trying to suppress minorities. And I'm going to tell you the primary reason why. The truth of the matter is, minorities make up such a small number of the actual voters that it's hard to believe that anyone really would care whether or not they're voting. I have seen this year after year after year. And it happens all the time. And I'm going to go slightly off track here and talk about the recent decision in New York to allow individuals who are on parole and or probation to vote. And everyone is making a big stink about that. The truth of the matter is that over 98% of men who are incarcerated have never voted. So they're not going to go out and vote. So I'm that believing that anyone is targeting minorities.
Leonardo, I'm going to leave it there because our time is short and get a response. Frankly, I think that's just naive. There's just so much history that proves it.
It's so much history that proves that. The targeting, particularly of African Americans, but there's also the targeting of Latinos, and it's well documented. It's North Carolina, where the Fourth Circuit says that the state legislature targeted African Americans with nearly surgical precision. One of the ways they did it with early voting. The impact of that was that black voter turnout in early voting went down by 8.5%. That means a lot in North Carolina.
And with respect to probation and parole, there are pushes on both sides, right? So there are movements to try to expand the numbers of voters who might be disproportionately African American. Unfortunately, when we're talking about that population, I guess that's a push and pull over the years. After you've served your time for a crime, how long should you continue to lose your right to vote for?
Right, because in Florida, you have permanent felony disfranchisement. What that means is we have 6.2 million people in the United States who are disfranchised because of a felony conviction. In Florida, 1.6 million of them reside in Florida. That means that 40% of black men cannot vote in Florida. Almost 23% of black adults in Florida cannot vote. Now, they get counted in the census so that Florida gets the kind of representation that they want in the House of Congress, in the U.S. Congress, but they don't have the ability to vote. It's almost like the 3/5 rule again. And wiping out that kind of population can tip the scales in an election in Florida.
And in Florida, you know who was a resident of Florida when he was alive? And there's a story that I've told a few times when we talk about this topic because it brings it home for people who aren't usually engaged in this. The late owner of the Yankees, George Steinbrenner, was a resident of Florida, and he was convicted of a campaign finance felony with respect to illegal contributions to the Nixon campaign, and he lost his ability to vote.
Wow.
And Ronald Reagan pardoned him.
See?
And the reason Ronald Reagan pardoned George Steinbrenner for illegal campaign contributions to Richard Nixon was so that George Steinbrenner could vote again in the state of Florida.
Boom. Boom.